We got to.
Good afternoon. Today we are in lesson 4 of our topic 4, which is solving equations. As you saw in the title, today we are talking about solving multiplication and division equations. So we've learned how to solve addition and subtraction equations, and now we're just going to take that to multiplication and division. So it's going to be essentially the same type of thing. We're going to be using the properties of equality and learning about what we can do to get the variable by itself. That's going to be our main goal in these equations. So when we talked about addition and subtraction, how do we undo subtraction? Well, we do addition. How do we undo addition? We do subtraction. It's the same thing with multiplication and division. How do we undo multiplication? You're going to do division. And how would you undo division? It's going to be multiplication. Those are, we talked about opposites, or the fancy math term is the inverse. You're just going to do the inverse of that operation. So what we're going to do now is we're going to get into our PBIL section. We're trying something new today. So you have your notes page with me, and I'm going to fill in the blanks as we go. You might not be able to see what I'm doing on the board, but I want to give you at least a visual, and you have this down in your notebook now, so hopefully you can see the questions a little bit easier to understand them. So here we go. Here's our first question that we're going to work through and figure this out. Suppose Riley Kate has twice as many pencils as AJ. If Riley Kate has 18 pencils, what equation can you write to show how many pencils AJ has? So again, if you need a little assistance, this is in your PBIL section in that template handout page that you got in class. It should be glued into your journal. And so here's the question. If you need to read it over again, you may. Go ahead and just pause and take a look at it. But here's some things. We need to pull out all the information we can first, and then we'll write our equation from that. So suppose Riley Kate has twice as many pencils as AJ. If Riley Kate has 18 pencils, what equation can we write to show how many pencils AJ has? A good tip when you're solving a problem like this is just underline the important information that you find. So we know that Riley Kate has twice as many pencils as AJ. That seems pretty important, right? And if Riley Kate has 18 pencils, so we know Riley Kate has 18 pencils. That's going to be important as well. So what I did now is I just have a few key questions that we're going to ask ourselves, and we're going to look and see if anything we underline is going to equate to those. So when we look at this problem, we're going to ask ourselves, what does the question tell us? And we're also going to ask ourselves, what is the question asking us overall? So overall, the question's asking us, what equation can we write to show how many pencils AJ has? So, how many pencils does Riley Kate have? That's something that we need to figure out first. Well, our problem tells us that Riley Kate has 18 pencils. So we'll fill in 18 for how many pencils she has. Because it's important to know what we already know, or just realize what we already know. What do you know about the number of pencils she has? So looking back in our problem, we know that Riley Kate has twice as many pencils as AJ. So that's some important information about the number of pencils that Riley Kate has. So what else do we know about the number of pencils she has? We know that she has twice as many as AJ. And I'm writing pretty big, but if you can't fit it all in line, just write around it, right close to it, you'll be fine. So now that we know our basic information, let's go back through our problem and see what we can use with the information we know and see if we can set up an equation to figure out just how many AJ has. So Riley Kate has twice as many pencils as AJ. If Riley Kate has 18 pencils, what equation can you write to show how many pencils AJ has? So for Riley Kate, I'm going to use R. And actually I'm going to make that a lowercase r. So for Riley Kate we have R. And for AJ we're going to use an A, just to make things easier. So now it's time to come up with our equation. So with our equation, we need to figure out, overall, we need to answer how many pencils AJ has. Because that's what the question asks us. Ultimately it gives us some information, but then it says, what equation can you write to show how many pencils AJ has? So that's our main goal, is to figure out how many pencils AJ has. So in order to figure this out, we need to look and see, and it says, suppose Riley Kate has twice as many pencils as AJ. So if we have Riley Kate, again we said that Riley Kate was R. If we have Riley Kate, and we know that she has 18 pencils, pencils, then this R is going to equal 18. So instead of Riley Kate has twice as many pencils as AJ, we said that since she has 18, we're going to plug in 18. So 18 equals, because Riley Kate has twice as many pencils as AJ. So Riley Kate's amount of pencils is twice as many as AJ. So if she has twice as many pencils as AJ, we can write 2 times A. And remember, whenever we have a coefficient next to a variable, coefficient being just the number in front of a variable, whenever we have a coefficient right next to a variable, that just means to multiply. So if this is confusing, what you could also write would be 18 equals 2 times A. So again, when we're using variables, we try to stay away from the multiplication sign, but if this is easier in your head right now, 18 equals 2 times A, which is the exact same equation as this. So now we have our equation. 18 equals 2 times A. Suppose Riley Kate has twice as many pencils as AJ. If Riley Kate has 18 pencils, what equation can you write to show how many pencils AJ has? So this is our equation. We took all of the information and wrote it. And now what we're going to work on is solving it. This one doesn't ask us to solve it, but we're going to go ahead and do it anyways, just so you can get some practice and see what we do. So I have down here a little reminder. It says, remember, look in your notes with me. The division property of equality tells us that we can divide both sides of an equation by the same number, as long as it's not 0, and the sides stay balanced. So that's our division property of equality. Essentially, what you do to one side, you have to do to the other. And just like with addition and subtraction, we use the inverse, or the opposite, of the operation that we're doing to get the variable alone. And in the beginning, we talked about how division is the opposite. It's how we undo multiplication. So here, next to the variable, we have 2 times A. The opposite, or the inverse, would be to divide. But we're not going to divide by A, because we don't want to get A over here. That would just keep moving A back and forth. We want A by itself. So to get A by itself, we're going to have to divide by 2. And when we divide by 2 on one side, just like this property we said, that means we're going to have to do it to the other side. So now, if we're taking 2 times A and then we divide it by 2, that cancels this out. It undoes it. Or you can look at it as 2 over 2 is equal to 1, right? If you have 2 halves, you have 2 halves of a whole pizza, you have a whole pizza. So it's 1 times A equals 18 divided by 2. And 18 divided by 2 is 9, so AJ has 9 pencils. So go ahead and make sure you have all those notes filled in. If you need to go back and review anything, go ahead and do that now. But we're going to go ahead and move to our guided practice section, and we're going to do some problems together. Here we are in our guided practice section. So what we're going to do is I'm going to walk you through the first couple ones. I'm going to guide you through them, and then I'll have you pause and try a couple on your own, and then I'll run through them again, and I'll show you step by step on how to answer them. So let's start with number 1. Again, this is in your journal now. So the directions say, in 1 and 2, explain how to get the variable alone in each equation. So we don't have to actually solve it right now. We just have to explain how to do that. So if you see, number 1 is 18x equals 36. Remember, we're just essentially going to undo whatever operation is being done to the variable to get it by itself. We just want to use the inverse, the opposite, right? So for this one, if we're taking 18 times x to equal 36, then to get x by itself, I'm going to do the opposite of the inverse. So I'm going to divide by 18. Remember, the equality property of division tells us that when we do one thing to one side, we have to divide it by the other if we're using division. So if I'm dividing one side by 18, I have to divide the next side by 18. So explain how to get the variables alone in each equation. All you need to do is divide both sides by 18. For number 2, we're looking at W divided by 3.3 equals 10. Again, we want to use the inverse, or the opposite, of the operation being done in the variable, because our goal is to get the variable by itself. If we have W divided by 3.3, then to get W by itself, I'm going to multiply times 3.3. When I do the opposite, or the inverse, it cancels it out. So now I have w by itself, but what I do to one side, I have to do it to the other side, because we're using the multiplication property of equality here. So now I need to take this side times 3.3. So again, explain how to get the variable alone. We need to multiply both sides by 3.3. So that's all we have to do for number 1 and 2. We're explaining how to get the variable alone in the equations. Let's look at problems 3 and 4. Now it tells us to solve the equation and check your answer. Remember, to check your answer, all you have to do is take the answer you get for your variable and just plug it right back into your original problem. If you check your answer and it makes the equation balanced, it makes it equal, then you know you got the right answer. If you check your answer and it's not equal, then you probably just did a simple little foundational mathematics skill along the way. You did 2 times 3 is 5 instead of 6 or something like that. So it's something easy to fix. So that's why it's important. We have to always show our work. If you don't show your work, we can't find the mistake along the way. So what I want you to do is go ahead, and we'll do number 3 together, and then I'll have you do number 4 on your own. So for number 3, we need to solve the equation, check our answer. We have 2 times t equals 12.5. Well, again, to get a variable by itself, we do the inverse of the operations being done to it. So we're multiplying by 2, so we're going to divide by 2. What I do to one side, I have to do to the other. So now we're left with t equals 12.5 divided by 2. If I set up my problem here and I do 12.5 divided by 2, well, we're going to just do our division like normal. In the last topic, we talked about how to divide with decimals. If that's something you don't remember how to do, you can absolutely just talk to me in class and we can get through it. But if we have a decimal in our dividend, the number on the inside, and nothing in our divisor, then we know we can just move our decimal right upstairs before we even start, just so we don't forget. So now, how many times will 2 go into 1? It will not. How many times will 2 go into 12? 6 times. 6 times 2 is 12. 12 minus 12 is 0. But I cannot stop because I still have numbers to go, even though I have 0. So I'm going to bring down my 5. 2 will go into 5 twice. And 2 times 2 is 4. 5 minus 4 is 1. But remember, we cannot just stop here and say that we have a remainder of 1 because our decimal is the remainder. Our decimal is what's left when we're working with decimals. So now we have to annex a 0, which is just a fancy word again for adding a 0. And since it's after the decimal, we can add as many zeros as we want. I'm going to bring down my 0. How many times will 2 go into 10? It will go in 5 times. 2 times 5 is 10. And 10 minus 10 is 0. So now that we're zeroed out and we're finished with our number, our answer that we're left with is 6.25. So we know that t equals 6.25. But remember, the question asks us to also check our answer. So to check our answer, all we need to do is plug in for t 6.25. So it's 2 times 6.25. And that should equal 12.5. And again, I realize I'm getting into the space over here. But I'm trying to write a little bit bigger for you. So if you can't contain it or keep it in the same spot, just kind of write it out to the margin. But make sure you're using all of your work. Okay? So go ahead. 2 times 6.25. To multiply decimals, again, we talked about this last topic, we need to just put the smallest number of digits on bottom. So 6.25 times 2. So the number with the largest number, the greatest number of digits goes on top, and the smaller number of digits goes on bottom. And then we just multiply like normal. 2 times 5 is 10, 2 times 2 is 4, plus 1 is 5, and 6 times 2 is 12. Remember, when we're using decimals in multiplying, we have to count how many place values are behind the decimal in both of the numbers going into the product, in both of these factors. So there's 2 behind the decimal, so in my answer I have to have 2 as well. So 6.25 times 2 is 12.5. And that was the original answer. So we know 6.25. Go ahead and try number 4 on your own. So pause the tape here, see what you come up with, and then I will work it through on the board with you. Alright, welcome back from trying that on your own. Go ahead and look at number 4 with me now, and just go ahead and just follow through with your work, and hopefully you have the same thing that I do. So r divided by 5 equals 22. My goal in this is to get r by itself. To get r by itself, I just have to do the opposite, or the inverse, of the operation that's being done here. Here in our problem we have division, so the opposite, what's going to undo this, is multiplication. So I'm going to take r times 5. What I did on one side, I have to do to the other side. So now I'm going to do 22 times 5. So on this side we canceled out, and r equals 22 times 5. 2 times 5 is 10. 2 times 5 is 10, 11. So r is going to be 110. But remember, we need to check our answer before we finish and say that we're done and wipe our hands clean of it, right? So all I have to do to check this is put what I say the variables into my original problem, and I can check it. So I'm going to have 110, and I'm going to divide that by 5. Actually, we'll just set it up how we're going to do it in the first place. So 110 divided by 5. 5 does not go into 1. 5 goes into 11 2 times. 2 times 5 is 10. 11 minus 10 is 1. We're going to bring down our 0. And 5 goes into 10 2 times. 2 times 5 is 10. And we're zeroed out. So x equals, or not x equals, but our answer is 22. So r equals 110 does equal 22. So we know that we have the correct answer. So go ahead and look at number 5 with me. So let's look at number 5 together. Number 5 asks us, in number 1, which property of equality did you use to get x alone? Well, if you remember in number 1, our problem was set up as 18x equals 36. So which property of equality did we use? Well, even though in the problem it's multiplication, we had to do the inverse of the operation being done to the variable to get it alone. So we divided each side by 18. The property that we used was the division property of equality. So now we're at number 6. In number 1, solve the equation and explain how you would check your answer. So remember, back in number 1, all we had to do was say, what would you do to each side to solve this equation? We said that we were going to divide each side by 18. Well, now number 6 is asking us to actually solve the equation and explain how you would check your answer. So again, we have 18x equals 36. I'm going to divide each side by 18. And I know now that x is by itself because those cancel out. So we have now x equals, and 36 divided by 18 is 2. So to solve it, x equals 2, but remember I'm not finished. How would I check my answer? I have to explain that, and so I'm just going to say, I'm going to plug in my answer to the original problem. So remember, if I plug in x equals 2 for my x now instead, so 18 times 2 equals 36. And 18 times 2 is 36, so my answer works, I know it's correct. So we're at the end of lesson 4.4 now. Hopefully you have a good understanding of how to solve equations using multiplication and division and applying the properties that we've talked about. So what I want you to do in this rate yourself section, remember we're not taking our quiz anymore. I want you to rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 meaning you don't understand it very well, and 5 meaning you feel confident you can take your quick check now. 1 to 5, but then you need to tell me, I rated myself, that's a typo there, I'll fix that for you. I rated myself a blank out of 5 because. Give me 1 to 2 sentences. Tell me which part you don't understand, which one's still kind of hazy for you. If you rate yourself 5 out of 5, tell me I understand what, but explain to me, I understand that when well, I'm not going to tell you what I understand because I would give you the answer, you could just write that. But tell me exactly how you feel about this topic lesson, and I will see you in class tomorrow.